Hello, this is Dr. Lori. Welcome to this discussion on an overview of study designs. These are certainly not all study designs that exist, and so it's not exhaustive. And the other thing to remember about study designs is that often they can't be compartmentalized really easily, but still it's helpful to learn about some of the very common study designs so that you have an idea of the strengths and limitations of each one and how you could answer a particular question more easily. So the first thing that I do when I think about study designs is I think about whether that particular study was done on a community level or on an individual level. And so for studies that are done on a community level, the questions that we're asking often are what do the trends tend to be? What are the things that we see across different communities? And so a common example of that would be if we were to look at different countries. Let's say we look at hundreds of different countries in the world and we compared infant mortality rates with life expectancy, average life expectancies. And we would see a clear relationship. The higher the infant mortality, the shorter the average life expectancy you have. And even when you correct for the idea that if we only took children who made it to, say, their first or their fifth birthday, still that relationship remains. So countries that tend to have a high infant mortality rate, also the adults don't tend to live as far into their older age group. A lot of times we'll look at countries and say, okay, well, what's the rate of the incidence rate of cardiovascular disease or some other particular outcome, and then we'll ask maybe a question about what kinds of foods do they eat, what kinds of activity is common for that particular country. And so we'll say, well, it looks like maybe olive oil is protective for heart disease. The problem with ecologic studies, as you may remember, is that we don't know if the exposure on the individual level ties in with the outcome on the individual level. So the people who are eating olive oil who are getting exercise or who are having that particular exposure, are they specifically the individuals that are being protected from heart disease or cancer or some other health outcome? And so ecologic studies have that distinct problem. Now theoretically, we could have on a community level, we could have other kinds of study designs. You just don't see them very often. So usually when you see something that's called an ecologic study, what they intend for that to be is really on a community level, the analogous type of study to a cross-sectional study. So they're generally cross-sectional in design, which means that if we were to look at time on an axis, then both the exposure and the outcome are measured at the exact same period of time. And so let me talk a little bit, let me go backwards here. Let me go back to the case report and case series. Often, one of the very first things that happens when we start noticing something is that either a health professional or a county health department starts noticing something is happening. And this is, you can think about this in terms of maybe the HIV epidemic. In the early 1980s, doctors started noticing that there were these young people coming in with cancers that typically they only saw in old people. Pneumocystis carinii, infections and cancers and that kind of thing. And so they thought, what's going on here? Why are these people getting these illnesses that usually the immune system is capable of handling? And so they named it acquired immune deficiency syndrome, or AIDS. So it wasn't an immune deficiency that this person was born with, or we would have known about it by now. So it's acquired, and the immune system was deficient. So they wrote up these reports. Other doctors in other parts of the country and other parts of the world said, yeah, we're noticing some of these same cases. What's going on? And so then we were able to kind of pool this observation of, something's going on here, so that more and more people are becoming aware of this as an issue. So case reports and case series often are the beginning of noticing that something is going on. And then as time goes by, we tend to do more and more sophisticated kinds of studies. And we don't have to necessarily do every single kind, but a lot of times we'll do some kind of a cross-sectional study. We'll just simply ask all of the individuals who are sick, tell us what's been going on. We'll try to find commonalities between those particular individuals. We did notice that they tended to be young gay men. Based on this cross-sectional information that we collected, a lot of times cross-sectional studies try to collect hundreds, if not thousands, of different kinds of variables. The same thing happened with babies that would die in their cribs, sudden infant death syndrome, SIDS. And so we would try to find out, what's going on here, what are some of the things that maybe we could do as an intervention that would help prevent this, and thus was born the Back to Sleep program. So put babies on their tummy, and they tend to have SIDS more commonly than if a baby is laid on their back. And so we do this cross-sectional type analysis and try to find as many variables and find out what's correlated or related, and see if we can establish some kind of a hypothesis. So up until this point, right about here, we have not generally done a lot of comparison between groups. And so if we've studied case reports, cross-sectional studies, ecologic studies, a lot of times people will call that hypothesis generating. And so we're trying to come up with, the researchers are trying to think of what could possibly be going on here. We're searching. And of course we can't get answers to a question we didn't ask, and so we want to ask as many possible things that we can in those cross-sectional or case reports. Ask about as many exposures as possible. Once we get to the right-hand side of this line, this is where we start doing more of analytic epidemiology. And so we think about case control studies instead of what you see here on the timeline here on the left, where the exposure and the outcome are measured at the same time. In a case control study, let's put our same timeline here, we find people with the outcome, so I'll put O for outcome, and we ask them about exposures that happened in the past. And this time period between when we say that we're asking about exposures and the outcome, often we're trying to think physiologically about what time period it would take for that exposure to actually cause the disease of interest to happen. So we need to be cognizant of what would be a logical induction period or a latency period for that particular exposure. For example, if we notice that somebody has been diagnosed with lung cancer today, we might ask them about how much did they smoke yesterday, but given that they may have quit because they were feeling so horrible, they might say, no, I'm a non-smoker. Well, yeah, a non-smoker maybe for the past week or month, but what we're really getting at is the exposure, say maybe 10 to 20 years ago, because that's how long it takes for lung cancer to really get established. So with a case control study, we find this group of people who have the outcome of interest or the disease, and then we also find a group of cases who do not have the outcome of interest, and we ask them about their same exposures. Now the interesting thing about a case control study is we have this one outcome, because remember we collected cases and controls that are specific to that particular outcome. Let's just say that it's lung cancer. We might ask them about dozens or hundreds of exposures. So exposure 1, exposure 2, exposure 3, exposure 4, and so on. We might ask them about lots and lots and lots of exposures because we want to get as much information in this case control study as we possibly can. So one of the clear limitations of a case control study is we can really only study one disease because we collected cases who have that disease. We can't do a case control study and say, well, I'd like to study 10 different unrelated outcomes. That's just not possible. So case control study has that particular limitation. A lot of times, though, case control studies are thought to be kind of like a quick way of getting some really valuable information because we can hone in on this very small group of cases with the outcome, and we don't have to study lots and lots of people for a long period of time. The next kind of study that we would do is the cohort study, and that's where, again, we have this timeline, but often and so it's considered a longitudinal study, but what we do is we collect information about certain exposures, and then we follow those people forward in time to see if they have that particular outcome of interest. Now, based on these multiple exposures, we can look at any given outcome. We can look at a variety of different outcomes. Maybe we want to look at lung cancer and heart disease and different other kinds of cancer, or maybe even amputation or vascular problems. So we can often look at multiple exposures if we have enough money to collect data on them, but we can also look at multiple outcomes. And so one of the key differences that you'll see here to the left and to the right of this line is that with the cross-sectional ecologic type studies, often what we're doing is we're collecting information about exposure and outcome at the same time, whereas with case control and cohort, really we've flipped that on its side and we're collecting information longitudinally over time. The only thing that we add with an experimental study is that this exposure is assigned by the researcher. These experimental studies are the clinical trials, field trials, different kinds of randomized studies, and so the key feature of experimental studies is that the exposure is assigned by the researcher rather than being selected by the subject. In contrast, then, all of these other studies are then considered observational. So when people talk about observational versus experimental, there are a really wide variety of different observational studies, all the way from case report up to longitudinal cohort, prospective cohort, and so that's kind of a collection of different kinds of study designs. So that summarizes study design as an overview. We'll be talking about the different types of studies individually as well. Thank you for joining me.